Good afternoon. I am Larry Horton, President of the Stanford Historical Society, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you, those here in this auditorium, and a far greater number of people who are joining us online. This is the first public event to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the founding of the Stanford Historical Society. The title of this afternoon's program is Chronicles of Stanford Architecture. This will be divided into two distinct parts. First, an illustrated lecture entitled Stanford Architecture, Its Beginnings, and second, a program entitled Arcades to Algorithms, which will discuss Stanford's latest major building, the recently opened Computer and Data Science Building, and how it will fit into Stanford's architectural heritage. I'll be back later with instructions on the second program. Now, it seems particularly fitting that we begin with a focus on a core historical moment in the history of this university. How was Stanford University designed and built? What were the big decisions in that undertaking, and who made them? To give us the answers, we are fortunate this afternoon to have with us the Wattis Professor of Art Emeritus, Paul V. Turner, who 50 years ago published the definitive book on the topic, The Founders and the Architects, the Design of Stanford University. I could say much more about Paul, but he specifically requested a very short introduction. His bio is in the program. Paul would rather talk to you than hear about himself. Ladies and gentlemen, Paul Turner.
Well, first I want to thank the Historical Society members who've made this talk possible, and especially Karen Bartholomew, who's been tremendously helpful in all sorts of ways, a multitude of ways. Well, when I first came to Stanford in 1971 to teach architectural history in the art department, I was amazed by the university's original architecture, the quads. I had never seen a campus like this in its formality and monumentality and the self-enclosed unity of the entire complex. Earlier American campus architecture, going back to the colonial period, was much more haphazard, with separate buildings being constructed as needed, usually open to nature or the environment, and without a unified plan. There were a few exceptions, notably Thomas Jefferson's University of Virginia, with buildings arranged around a central lawn, as it's called, but with less complexity and monumentality than the Stanford quads. Excuse me. And there's another important feature of the Stanford plan. It's arcades, connecting all the buildings, which serve several functions. There are the practical functions, of course, such as protecting people from rain and shading the buildings from excessive sunlight and heat. But equally important is the way the arcades integrate all the buildings, making the whole more than the sum of the parts. So the campus is not just a collection of individual structures. This, in my opinion, is one of the best and most distinctive features of Stanford's architecture. So I wondered how this Stanford plan came to be, and I tried to find out. Not much was known at that time, except that Frederick Law Olmsted was involved and some other aspects of the story. Also, just before I came to Stanford, a body of Olmsted correspondence and some drawings had been acquired by the university archives, which were very helpful to me. Excuse me. Following up on this, I went to Boston one summer and gained access to the Olmsted archive, which was still in the Olmsted home and studio in Brookline, just outside of Boston. It's now in the Olmsted archive is now in the National Archives in Washington. And I made some discoveries there, one of which I'll mention in a bit. The chairman of the art department, Lawrence Eitner, got interested in what I was doing and suggested that we put together a small exhibition on the subject in the art gallery, the building across from the northeast corner of the quad. Lawrence also proposed a catalog or booklet to be published at the same time as that exhibition. And this is what became The Founders and the Architects. I included in it a couple of essays written by students who had taken a graduate seminar I gave on this subject, Karen Weitze and Marcia Vitrock. Well, now let me mention some of the key elements of the story. Leland and Jane Lathrop Stanford's only child, Leland Jr., died in 1884 in Florence. His grieving parents soon decided to create a university in memory of him. And for the school's physical plan, they wanted to engage the foremost planners in the country. These were clearly Olmsted, the landscape planner, and the architect Henry Hobson Richardson, usually called H.H. Richardson. Here we see the two of them. As you can see here, Richardson on the right there, you can see he was a rather large man. And some people have suggested that this might have had something to do with the heaviness and powerfulness of his architecture. He liked good food and drink. However, just as the Stanfords were contacting Richardson, he died unexpectedly at the age of only 48. Maybe because he liked food and drink so much. His firm was continued by his principal assistants and became Shepley, Rutan, and Coolidge. And it was Charles Coolidge who was engaged to work with Olmsted on the Stanford plan. And here we have a photo of Coolidge in the center there. But much later in his life, he was only 28 when he was engaged to work at Stanford. I couldn't find a good photo of him when he was younger. Later I'll show a not-so-good photo. Then in September of 1886, Olmsted came from Boston to the Stanford farm and estate at Palo Alto to see the site. And here's where one of my discoveries is relevant. When I went to the Olmsted archives in Brookline, I examined a number of drawings for the Stanford design, but then as I was passing through another part of the archive where there were hundreds of rolled up drawings in racks, I just happened to notice, purely by chance, the corner of a drawing on which the word Stanford was written. It had apparently been misfiled in the archive. I took it out of the rack and unrolled it and saw the full inscription. Stanford, Leland Stanford Junior University, first study. And it was dated September 26, 1886, just as Olmsted was visiting the site. It had clearly been drawn by him. The drawing was in pencil and too faint for me to photograph, so I traced it on a large sheet of tracing paper and then redrew it. And this is what's in The Founders and the Architects. This is my redrawing of that plan. But recently, Cyrus Patel, who's been doing some research on this first study of Olmsted's, he found the actual drawing on the National Archives website. And there's the original drawing that I redrew. So this was Olmsted's idea of what the Stanford campus should be: separate buildings on curving roads in a park-like setting. There's a topographical map drawn on the back of the sheet, which shows that it was to be on hilly terrain south of where the quads are today. And Cyrus Patel has identified the location as that of the knoll. Well, this plan is exactly what one would expect Olmsted to design for a campus: a picturesque group of buildings in a kind of park, similar to his other designs for educational institutions, such as the Lawrenceville School in New Jersey, also of 1886. But when the Stanford saw it, they rejected it completely, this plan of Olmsted's. And they told Olmsted what they did want: a much larger, more formal design, and on the flatland, not in the hills. Well, why did the Stanfords want their university to be on flatland? When I was beginning my research, one statement I came across was that they wanted it there because Leland Jr. had ridden his horse there. Well, maybe so, but that wasn't the real reason. The university had to be on flatland so it could be grand in size, formal, and unified, not a picturesque park in the hills. Only this would be a proper memorial to the dead child. So I began to realize something. Not only the university was a memorial to Leland Jr., but its physical plan was determined by the same motives. And I started finding more examples of this, which we'll see throughout this talk. We'll see several more. Well, beginning with this first episode, the relationship between Olmsted and the Stanfords was difficult, as Olmsted and then Coolidge almost always had to capitulate to the Stanfords' wishes. Back in Boston, Olmsted and Coolidge began drawing up plans for the quadrangles as the Stanfords described what they wanted, but the designs continually had to be modified. And let me mention a particularly telling example of this. Here on the left is one of the stages of the Olmsted-Coolidge design done in February 1887 when they were back in Boston. And on the right is a rough perspective sketch of this plan, which is not by Olmsted or Coolidge, but it was published in the San Francisco Examiner, and it's probably a drawing by a newspaper reporter based on a model of this plan that no longer exists. And you can see that the quadrangle is oriented north-south rather than east-west, as it turned out to be, with the church on the side, so that when you entered the quad, you'd have a vista to the hills beyond. In other words, as you entered here, this would have been the entrance to the university. You can see the entrance would be here, and then you'd have a vista to the hills beyond, turned around from the way it became. And Coolidge came here from Boston and showed the Stanfords this plan. And following the meeting, he reported back to Olmsted in a remarkable letter of May 1887. And let me read the crucial part of it. Quote, "We had the surveyors stake out the inner quad buildings, and when it was completed, we went over the ground with the Stanfords, and they said it faced the wrong way, and that they never intended entering the quad from the ends, but wished the main drive to be on the long side. And we showed them how by this change they lost the vista to the back hills through the trees because the church would cut it off. But they thought the vista was long enough and would end more appropriately at the church. Finally, we told them that this would change the grade and would upset your work," meaning Olmsted's work, to which the governor replied, "A landscape architect and an architect might be disappointed, but he was going to have the buildings the way he wanted them." Both Mr. and Mrs. S. think the main entrance should be a large memorial arch with an enormously large approach. And in fact, the very quietness and reserve, which we like so much in the plan, is what they want to get rid of, unquote. So, the Stanfords did not want the focus to be a vista to the hills, the way we see it here, but to be the church, that would be the focus. And again, I think we see their insistence that the university's architecture proclaim its purpose as a memorial, and indeed, in this case, proclaim the sacredness of the memorial. The enormously large approach that Coolidge referred to was what became Palm Drive, and the large memorial arch was this gargantuan structure. It's an architectural form, of course, that goes back to Roman triumphal arches, and throughout history has been mainly used to represent military victories. Hardly quiet and reserved as Coolidge said that he and Olmsted wanted. By the way, the frieze at the top of the arch had a rather peculiar iconography. It was called the March of Civilization, but it was almost totally about California. It began with the conversion of the Native Americans by the Spanish missionaries, then touched on various aspects of the history of California, and concluded, apparently as the culmination of civilization, with Leland and Jane on horseback, forging their way through the Sierra Nevada, with the railroad following, as you can see. What we see here is not the actual frieze itself, but part of the plaster or clay prototype for it. There were no detailed photos of the frieze itself, because the arch was completed in 1901, but only 5 years later was the earthquake which destroyed it. Well, getting back to the plan for the quads, here's the final design as it was published in 1888. Often it's called the Olmsted Plan, but probably should be called the Olmsted-Stanford Plan, since, as we've seen, it was actually conceived largely by Leland and Jane. And we see that the main quad is flanked to the east and west by similar quadrangles for future expansion. And that's, you can see, here's the quads as they are today, and then these were to be the quadrangles on either side for expansion, showing how ambitious the Stanford's vision of their university was. Reportedly, Olmsted later said that he hadn't realized how much money the Stanfords had, or how much money they were willing to spend on their university. On May 14th of 1887, which was Leland Jr.'s birthday, the cornerstone laying ceremony took place. as we see here. And to the right of Leland, just sort of hidden, we see the head of Charles Coolidge. That's the not-so-good photo that I mentioned before that shows him when he was at the time. And by the way, I hadn't noticed until putting this talk together how gigantic Jane's bustle was. I was curious about this and found a couple of articles on the history of the bustle. I sometimes get off on odd tangents like this when I'm doing my work or my research. And none of the illustrated bustles in these articles were this large. Also, the fashion of the bustle had just about ended by this time. So I wondered why Jane wore this kind of exaggerated bustle for the cornerstone laying. I have no idea, but I just thought I'd mention it. Anyway, getting back to more important things. I guess just about anything is more important than Jane's bustle. Here's the central portion of that extraordinary bird's eye rendering of the design. In the left-hand corner of the entire sheet, this is just the central portion of it, are the initials DAG. At first, I didn't know what they stood for, but then I figured out that it was David A. Gregg. He was an expert architectural renderer who worked for prominent architectural firms in the Boston area. He also wrote a book on architectural rendering. We at Stanford are fortunate that one of his beautiful drawings represents the design of our campus. Well, what about the actual architecture of the quad buildings, which were designed by Charles Coolidge? As I mentioned earlier, the Stanfords had wanted to engage H.H. Richardson, the most prominent architect in America at that time, but he suddenly died, and his firm kept going as Shepley, Rutan, and Coolidge, and their first major commission was for Stanford. So naturally, they were continuing to design just as Richardson would have done in the so-called Richardsonian Romanesque style. Well, what is this style? Here we see, in the next slide, here's one of Richardson's most notable buildings, Trinity Church in Boston, which incorporated most of the traits of his version of the Neo-Romanesque, a style that had been used previously in America to some extent. This Neo-Romanesque style drew mainly from the pre-Gothic French and Spanish buildings of the 11th and 12th centuries. But Richardson interpreted it in his own novel and imaginative ways. And some of the features we see here include rough masonry walls, heavy round arches, details loosely based on Romanesque forms, such as column capitals and decorative details, and polychromy, the use of different colors of stone. And if we compare Trinity Church on the right here to Coolidge's first design for Memorial Arch on the left, we see how close the two towers in particular are. This is, on the left, is not a drawing by Coolidge, but a sketch that was published in a newspaper. Yeah, but apparently it does show Coolidge's first design, which hasn't survived. Coolidge then modified the design of the Stanford Tower, but its eventual form was still very similar to the Trinity Church Tower. And there, of course, we see it. And let's see some more views of the quads. Here on the left, the arch passageway from Memorial Court into the inner quad, which shows a bit of the polychromy that Coolidge used at Stanford. And on the right, one of the piers of the Memorial Church facade, with details that come right out of Richardson's work. So here at Stanford, we have the next best thing to buildings actually by H.H. Richardson himself. And let's see another example of Coolidge using one of Richardson's designs. This is, let's see, this is the Memorial Arch, of course, and Richardson's design on the right for an arch planned for Buffalo, New York, which was never constructed. And let's see another comparison. One of the outer quad buildings here at Stanford, you see on the left, and Richardson's Austin Hall at Harvard, the law school building, where there are similar series of arches and patterns of fenestration above. I should point out that in 1893, Leland Stanford died, and Jane took over the running of the university, including continuing the construction. At this time, the inner quad buildings were largely completed except for the church. And let's see an early photo here. This is in 1891, the inner quad. And you see just the front of the bottom part of the church, and the rest of the church had not been completed at that time or hadn't been built by 1881. And the outer quad buildings were mostly not built when Leland died. For assistance, Jane relied on two of her brothers, Charles and Ariel Lathrop, especially for supervision of technical details and construction. Unfortunately, the brothers were not nearly as competent in these matters as Leland had been, and Leland's associates. And in the 1906 earthquake, many of the buildings constructed after Leland's death, including Memorial Church, were damaged or destroyed. Here you see the church. What happened was that the tower of the church completely collapsed and into the church, blowing out the facade of the building in the process. I should point out that a good deal earlier, Olmsted and Coolidge had largely departed from the scene, mainly because of that problem that had caused trouble from the beginning. Who was to be in control of the design? As early as 1889, Leland had written to Olmsted, quote, "I do not want any more new work undertaken with Coolidge," although the reason he gave was that the work was costing too much. And in the next year, Stanford was already giving supervision of some of the construction to Jane's brother, Ariel, which led to a good deal of conflict with Olmsted and Coolidge. Olmsted wrote a long letter to Stanford saying, among other things, quote, "I am too old a man to be reasonably asked to put aside all that I've learned of my business because a man of Mr. Lathrop's training and habits has not learned as much," unquote. And several new architects were being hired to design the buildings or handle details of design new buildings or handle details of buildings that were already under construction. Well, now I'd like to turn to a couple of buildings that were designed by two of these new architects and are not in the quads. The chemistry building, now old chemistry on the left there, the building that we're in now or that we're behind, and the museum on the right. The chemistry building was designed by Clinton Day and completed in 1903. We can see that Clinton Day was adhering pretty carefully to Richardson's style of architecture in its heavy stone walls. Let's see, I think I have another picture of the chemistry building. Yeah. And arches and fenestration patterns and even a bit of polychromy. It was apparently only slightly damaged in the earthquake, and from the beginning was considered a successful building. It was praised, for example, for being one of the largest and best equipped chemical buildings and chemistry buildings in the country. Well, next let's turn to the museum. Now the Cantor Arts Center, of course. It's one of the most interesting buildings at Stanford, in my opinion, for a number of reasons. First, some background. When Leland and Jane decided to create a memorial to Leland Jr., they first were thinking of a museum in San Francisco. But when they set their sights higher and decided on a university, a museum continued to be an important part of their plans, and especially of Jane's plans. In some of the early designs for the quads, one of the outer quad buildings was designated as the museum. But then Jane decided it had to be a separate building so it could be larger, and for another reason which I'll get to in a moment. But why was a museum so important to the Stanfords, and especially to Jane? Mainly because museums had been very important to Leland Jr. He was a serious child by all accounts, and among his interests were art, antiquity, and archaeology. On the family's grand tours of Europe, he especially liked visiting museums. His tutor, Herbert Nash, later said that the boy's favorite activity was museum going, and that, quote, he had been through half the famous galleries of Europe, unquote. One of the rooms at in the Stanford Mansion in San Francisco was his own little museum with antiquities and other items he had collected. So it was important that a museum be a major part of the university, and Jane took it on as her special project. Another reason the museum had to be separate from the quads, besides its size, was that Jane decided it would be modeled on a specific European building which was at odds with the architecture of the quads. And this was, well, at the top is the Stanford Museum, just as it was being built. But at the bottom, we see here this building that Jane wanted to pattern the museum after, the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. In January of 1884, just 2 months before Leland Jr.'s death in Florence, he had visited this Athens museum, and with his tutor, Herbert Nash, who later recalled that the famous archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann had spent part of a day with the two of them there in this museum, and even gave Leland Jr. some small objects from Troy for his own museum back home. And you can see how similar the two buildings are, although the Athens Museum is larger, and that both are neoclassical in style, in contrast to the Richardsonian Romanesque of the quads. So not only the museum was the institution of the museum was a memorial to Leland Jr., but its architecture was determined by the same motive, just that point we saw with the quads. In October of 1890, Jane engaged the San Francisco architectural firm of Percy and Hamilton and gave them photos of this Athens museum and to use as a prototype. They designed the building, the Stanford Museum, construction began, and it was structurally complete in little more than a year, although it wasn't actually ready for visitors until 1894. But the significant thing about the museum, in my opinion, is something that many people aren't aware of, I think. And this has to do with the museum's method of construction. Jane wanted the museum to be built as quickly as possible, and Percy and Hamilton suggested that for speed, the building could be constructed using reinforced concrete. This was a radical thing to do. Reinforced concrete was a new material at this time and was used only for utilitarian buildings like warehouses, or for certain structural parts of buildings where it would be covered by more conventional materials. And it was unheard of, really, at this time for a respectable building to be made completely of exposed reinforced concrete. And the Stanford Museum was apparently the first in the world. Also, its size was notable for a building made out of reinforced concrete. During its construction, the Scientific American magazine reported on it and said it was, quote, the largest building in the world made of artificial stone, a term that was the term that was often used at that time for concrete. Well, here we see the museum under construction with the scaffolding and form boards in which the concrete was poured. It was done in horizontal sections so the concrete could dry before the next layer was poured. And the form boards are still partly on the topmost level. It's a little hard to see, but the form boards are still up there. Another factor was that one of the foremost innovators in reinforced concrete, Ernest Ransome, was based in San Francisco and often worked with Percy and Hamilton. Ransome had devised certain innovations that facilitated the use of reinforced concrete, including a new type of reinforcing rod. And let me make a brief digression about what reinforced concrete is, if you don't mind my getting just a bit technical. Concrete itself, which had been used as early as ancient Roman times, does not work for beams or floor slabs because it can crack or break under pressure. It doesn't have tensile strength. But if concrete is poured around iron rods, the tensile strength of the iron reinforces the beam or slab, and that's why it's called reinforced concrete. In my little diagram here, the reinforcing rod is at the bottom of the beam where it would otherwise be likely to crack. However, the early use of reinforced concrete had a problem. The iron rods, under pressure, would often slip a bit through the concrete, reducing their effectiveness. Ernest Ransome invented a solution to this, and here we see his patent for this invention of his. By twisting square rods, and you see that over on the right side of the slide, they couldn't slip under pressure. And the Stanford Museum was the first structure that used this device, or at least in a major way. And by the way, Stanford's or Ransome's invention is still in use today, not by twisting the rods, but by having ridges along their surface. And this you'll be familiar with these reinforcing rods that, of course, you see everywhere today in the construction of buildings. So this crucial detail of modern construction goes right back to Ransome and to the Stanford Museum. And let me mention another of Ransom's innovations. The museum's walls are exposed concrete, but he wanted to give them a more attractive look by treating the concrete in special ways. Otherwise, when concrete is poured and the form boards are removed, the surface of the concrete is often uneven and sometimes has stains, and it can weather badly. Ransom devised ways to make the concrete look like stone. In fact, different kinds of stone surfaces, by manipulating it after the form boards were removed. The architectural historian Peter Collins wrote about this, quote, "The Stanford Museum was probably the first building in which the concrete was treated to show the texture of the aggregate." Aggregate is the pebbles or bits of stone that are in concrete. And continuing with Collins, he said, "Ransom set a precedent for treating concrete as possessing a natural nobility of its own. For the first time, concrete was considered to be capable of displaying an inherent beauty," unquote. Ransom's techniques for treating concrete surfaces are still used today, for example, in what's called exposed aggregate. Well, Jane had tremendously ambitious plans for the museum and started adding long extensions to it. And we can see this in a plan that I drew, where you see the original building, which is now still exists, plus all of these are the extensions that Jane actually built onto the museum. The added buildings, the added parts of the building, were not designed by Percy and Hamilton, and the construction was not well supervised. And in the 1906 earthquake, they were all destroyed. All of those other parts of the building that Jane built were completely destroyed, really. An engineer's report following the quake noted that the earlier university buildings had survived pretty well, while the later ones were heavily damaged. And the report said, quote, "The line was so sharply drawn that the main body of the museum, carefully built of reinforced concrete, was almost uninjured, while its wings, constructed of poorly built brick and stone, were ruined," end quote. And let me mention two other buildings created by Jane Stanford that also had an unhappy fate. A gymnasium and here, I'd forgotten that I put in a picture that shows before the earthquake, all these extensions. This is the museum that we have today, but all these extensions that came around that were destroyed in the earthquake. But now I want to see two other buildings, a gymnasium and a library, which were planned and constructed shortly before Jane's death, which was in February of 1905. They were along Palm Drive across from the museum. And in the case of the library on the right here, it was originally intended to be in one of the outer quad buildings. But Jane wanted these two buildings to be large structures and also wanted them to be in more or less classical styles. They were designed by a couple of Jane's new architects, and they were built quickly with poor construction supervision. And in the 1906 earthquake, both buildings were completely destroyed. Here's the library after the earthquake. It was no doubt fortuitous that Jane died shortly before the earthquake, which destroyed most of the buildings that she alone had planned and constructed. It would have devastated her, of course. Well, let me mention something else about the museum, the mosaics on it. Jane had become fascinated with mosaics during the family's trips to Europe, especially the mosaics on St. Mark's Basilica in Venice. There were 8 panels of mosaics on the facade of the museum that you see here, and plus ones on the pediments at the ends of the buildings, of the building. Jane commissioned them from the Salviati art studios in Venice, and they were executed by workers who came from Venice to Stanford. But these mosaics pale in comparison with the ones Jane commissioned for Memorial Church, of course. Here we see the church facade before the earthquake on the left in an old photograph, and as it is today, of course. You'll recall that the upper part of the wall of the church was exploded outward in the quake, and it had to be rebuilt. And here's a detail of one of the parts of the mosaic where you can see the individual tesserae, the tiny pieces of stone or colored glass that form a mosaic and are often covered in gold leaf, as here, in some of the tesserae here. I guess we might consider this a kind of polychromy, but completely different from that of Richardson and Coolidge. They never covered their buildings with mosaics. And Coolidge, no doubt, would have disapproved of their use on, I meant to say Richardson and Coolidge. They never covered their buildings with mosaics, and Coolidge, no doubt, would have disapproved of their use on Memorial Church. Personally, I've got to admit that I'm not so wild about the mosaics myself, but I don't mean to suggest that they shouldn't be here. As we've seen from the beginning of the story, the Stanfords often overruled the ideas of Olmsted and then of Coolidge, and the Stanford campus would be completely different if they hadn't. Jane's mosaics were one of her contributions, so they help show the multiple factors and personalities that combined to produce the campus as we know it today. And this suggests another point. One would think that if an architect and a client are continually in conflict, the result would be a kind of hodgepodge with no unity or integrity. But remarkably, in the Stanford case, this is not true. The collaboration between the architects and both of the clients produced a great success, in my opinion. In fact, it is the best example that I can think of in American architecture of such success coming out of such conflict. Well, finally, getting back to the basic story, Stanford University was, of course, a memorial to Leland Jr. Its official name, of course, is the Leland Stanford Junior University. However, I hope that I've been able to demonstrate this afternoon that not only the university, but also Stanford's architecture has Leland Jr. written all over it. Thank you.
All right, now we'll be open things to questions.
Thank you, Larry, and thank you, Paul, for that wonderful presentation. This question actually came from a pre-submitted question from folks before today, and one of them was, what was the source of the sandstone for the earliest buildings, particularly the inner quad and the columns?
Yes, the sandstone, as I understand it, was from a quarry near San Jose, the New Almaden quarry. And if you want to know more about it, you should consult Charlie Junkerman over here, who's the expert on that. And so I don't know whether you want to say anything or whether maybe we should move on to another question. But really, yeah. But Charlie is the expert to consult about the sandstone. Yeah.
Yes. Someone has a microphone there? Please.
Did you say something about the decisions taken after the earthquake as to what to rebuild, what not to rebuild, and for the rebuilding that did take place, what changes were made?
Right. Well, of course, some things were obviously not rebuilt, like the Memorial Arch, and also the upper part of the tower of the church, and that was, I think, probably mainly due to financial reasons, because after the quake, the university was in bad shape, and but other buildings had to be repaired, and but it was some time before then they started building new structure, major new structures. The earthquake was obviously a tremendous, a terrible loss to the university.
There's a question here.
This building, the old chemistry building, I think you mentioned that after the earthquake in 1906, it was not damaged by that earthquake.
Well, I said not. I think I said slightly damaged, or only slightly damaged.
But I believe you said it continued in use. Then, much later on, this building lay in disuse for quite some time, several decades, I believe, until it was restored as the SAP Center. What explains the long period of disuse?
That's a good question, and I don't really know the answer to that, but does anyone here want to answer that question? There's someone right behind you.
In 1989, we had a devastating earthquake, and because I used to teach in Old Chem, and it rendered the building unusable. And the reason it sat there for so long is it was difficult to find a donor who wanted to fix up a destroyed building.
Yeah.
And so it housed the chemistry library, laboratories, and faculty on the second and third floors. And then thousands of pigeons in the attic. But it was used by some engineering colleagues of mine who surreptitiously held wine tastings in some of the old laboratories because we could get into the building and make use of it. So it wasn't totally unused. And we considered wine tasting to be part of chemistry, so it's...
Thank you.
There's a question in the back.
Thank you so much for your presentation. This was really wonderful. I wondered if you could speak a little bit about Robley Hall. I understand that was a dorm that was built fairly early on, and there were some architectural issues, including concerns about the structure where they had to close the dorm.
Yeah, well, that was, I believe, built in the 1920s. But I'm afraid that I don't know an awful lot about the details of the construction of that. Again, there are probably people here who could talk about that much better than I. But maybe we should move on to another question. I don't.
Great.
We've heard about the source of the stone for the quad, but I've heard a story, perhaps apocryphal, about what became of all the soil that was excavated when these buildings were constructed. I wonder if you know that. I can try to repeat, but as I say, I don't have it on much authority. So is that familiar to you? What happened when the excavations for the quad were done? What I was told, what I heard.
Yeah, tell us what you
I'll
were
tell you
told,
what I heard.
because you know about that and I know nothing
and
about
there
it.
are probably quite a few other people here too, because what I heard at the dedication of Frost Amphitheater after it was resurrected, and that was that on that particular site, it was the soil that was excavated from Quad was just trucked over there and dumped. And for some very long period of years, there was a large mound of dirt there. And eventually it dawned on someone that they could hollow it out and have an amphitheater, that everything was there that they needed. They just needed to readjust the shape. And that would have been probably. Well, it was built in memory of a polio victim, so we know the last of that was after the vaccine around 1949. So, and my source on this was a wonderful presentation. I think that this organization had something to do with when Frost was indeed reopened after refreshing.
Yeah, thank you.
Updates.
Thank you.
There's other questions right there.
Larry?
Yes. Please.
Hi. I was curious, how was David Starr Jordan involved with the architecture or campus planning before and after Jane's death?
That's a complicated story. But we know that Jordan, as well as many other people, faculty and so forth, were not happy with all of the construction that Jane was undertaking, in lieu, in many cases, of paying, expending money on the teaching functions of the university and the faculty, and it may have been he who referred to Jane's Stone Age. I don't know the details of all of that, but there definitely was some conflict between Jordan and Leland Stanford, Jane Stanford in this case.
Thank you.
This is a blatant attempt to become your favorite question. Where is your book currently available for purchase?
Well, that's a good, maybe Larry, you know more about that than I. Where is the Founders and the Architects, the new edition of it, available for purchase?
Oh, well, there are some copies, and if you're a member, one is available for you. If you're not a member, then please give us your name out front, and we'll see you get a copy.
Hi. As a member of the first male class to occupy Robley Hall, I can give a few comments about it. I don't know much about the origination of it, but I do note that Robley Hall was the women's dorm located on one far corner of the campus, and Encino Hall was the men's dorm located at the diagonally opposite part of the campus. And Encina and Robley are both names of oak trees that exist both in Spain and here in California. Regarding the rebuilding of the Robley Hall, I think Norm may even know more about this, but it happened because a student was reviewing the architectural plans for Robley and noticed that some of the support was, I think, clay, the kind of clay used in clay pipes, which obviously is not very seismically resistant. This was brought eventually to the attention of the school administration, and they decided to immediately close the dorm. And this happened to be noticed just before winter break, I think. And so when the students left, they were told they weren't coming back to the dorm. And that's how suddenly it was closed. It allowed the dorm to be restructured and structurally supported. And that came just before, I think, the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake, which would have probably destroyed the entire building. Regarding the SAP Center here, part of the delay had to do with trying to engineer how to keep the original look of the building, but support it seismically from the interior. So the complete interior structural support had to be redesigned with steel. And there was, on the reopening of the building, there's a description of that process. And part of it was that they had to remove the interior structure of the building, and the front facade was still there. So it looked like there was a regular building standing, but it had no support whatsoever. And if an earthquake had happened, the entire facade would have collapsed. So they had their fingers crossed until they could rebuild the steel structure on the interior to keep it supported and structurally sound. Then finally, regarding the excess earth, I do recall having worked here during the 1980s and 90s, talking to one of the administration people, and they mentioned, to my surprise, that this excess earth is considered to be a valuable product. And the construction contracts, which I was involved in writing, had to specify that the contractor would not remove the excavated earth from the campus. And I think a lot of it was stored on the west end of the campus, and of course became useful in later construction projects.
Thank you. Yes, we have a question here.
Regarding the museum construction, there must be some stone in the pillars and the corner columns?
Oh, no, you mean visible from the outside?
Or just in general?
No, it's all reinforced concrete. Wow. Yeah, and it looks like stone from the outside because of what I was saying, that one of Ransom's innovations was treating reinforced concrete to look like different types of stone surfaces, to make them more attractive and maybe to make it a little more conventional looking. Since it was so radical, the idea of building an important building, not a warehouse or something, but respectable architecture, building it out of reinforced concrete was just unheard of. And that's really the thing that interests me probably most about the Stanford Museum, is that it's a very important role in the construction history of construction, of architectural construction.
Yeah, and that interior space too, once you get in the museum in that high building.
Yeah, it's all reinforced concrete.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
I think we have time for just one last question. And Paul, I have a question from someone on the Zoom audience for you. If the founders were designing Stanford today, what aspects of the original plan do you think they would preserve or change?
If the Stanfords were still involved today, well, I think they would have wanted to just continue in the styles that they were designing. So it's one of those kind of historical questions. What if people of long ago were living today? What would they do differently? And it usually means they do everything differently.
Thank you so very much.